I'll just throw a quick question out there. How many people, does anyone know the percentage of people that are afraid of public speaking in the population? Anyone? Any percentage? Anyone think of a number? Yes? 80%. Very close. I read somewhere, yes? I read somewhere today it's 74%. And I also read that there was another statistic that 54% of people afraid of public speaking are actually rate their fear of public speaking over death. So it's for a lot of people it really is quite a fear, and it is based. I think it's called Glossophobia. It's a specific phobia. But what I thought, and one of the things is, does anyone think I'm anxious about coming here and speaking to a group tonight? Well, I am, absolutely. And I should be, because I don't public speak every day, and I've had social phobia and a real fear of public speaking. I think I would have been in the 54% at some point in my life for sure. So a lot is actually possible. And the fact is, when you've got some social anxiety as well, there's always this fear of being evaluated and judged. But when you hear that 74% of people are actually fear public speaking across the board, then looking at it differently, it's 74% of this room empathizes with the fact that better him than me standing up there. So I will get into the slide presentation, and then we'll carry on from there. So it's called Living with Anxiety. And so what is anxiety? Well, it's a normal emotional reaction to perceived danger. It helps the body prepare itself and deal with danger, and it actually is essential for our survival. So we've all heard of the fight, flight, fear response. It's the adrenaline kicking in, and in many situations where if you encounter a bear on a pathway, and there's a lot of bear sightings in Vancouver right now, to have your adrenaline kick in, to put the blood to the big muscles, to start yourself sweating and your heart pounding is getting the blood to your big muscles. This is all very essential in that situation. What ends up happening, though, with people with moderate to extreme anxiety is a lot of it is based in future thinking, and it's like the analogy of having the smoke detector, but the smoke detector is set to a point where it's overly sensitive. So it's going off every time you make toast, and that's not how it's supposed to work. So similarly with people with clinical anxiety, their smoke detector, their adrenaline response is kicking in, and it's far too sensitive. And there are ways of readjusting the smoke detector or our reaction to triggers, thoughts, feelings, and memories of sometimes traumatic events. Anxiety is not a personality problem. It's not a thought disorder. Nobody's crazy. Although when you're in the throes of a panic attack, it can feel like it's that out of control, like you are going to lose it, especially if sometimes it also has a sort of an out-of-body feel to it. Does a person have a weak body or mind? Absolutely not. Is there something wrong with you? No. I heard a doctor, a psychologist, talk about it because it's all about relating to people on their level, with whatever they're working in, but he said it's a software problem, not a hardware problem. And I like that analogy. The fact that it's a software problem, and software can be updated, it can be, rebooted, you can get new software. Anxiety, as far as the continuum, there really is a level of when anxiety, you can have too little of it. And too little would be apathy. I mean, if somebody never leaves the couch or has no motivation to get up in the morning to go to work, a whole bunch of things. Now, I'm not saying that it's just an anxiety-related issue, but at the same time, having extremely low anxiety is not a motivator. So, average anxiety, pretty manageable. As you go up the scale toward high anxiety, you might have sort of described as shy or nervousness starting to come in. And when the anxiety is extremely high and it starts to affect decisions you're making, quality of life, and the big thing with anxiety is avoidance. People start to avoid a whole bunch of things because of their anxiety, and things that they would really rather be doing in their life, but they won't because of the anxiety. That looks like a grizzly. Is that a grizzly? I guess we don't have too many of them here, thank goodness. But anxiety is adaptive. So just as I said with the smoke detector, even though anxiety, a person can have some social anxiety or otherwise, you can also readjust that. You're never stuck with, you're born with a certain point that your anxiety is at, that through trauma, it adapts and it can actually come across as post-traumatic stress disorder, but at the same time, on sort of the positive side of it, with different therapies and different techniques, you can also sort of undo what was done. So that's the adaptive sort of look at how anxiety works. So when is it a problem? Well, when it causes excessive emotional distress or significant impairment to functioning. So if you have difficulties with day-to-day tasks because of the anxiety, if it interferes with work, school, social life, loss of independence, frequent visits to the doctor, and quite often with a lot of anxiety, especially on the social side of it, and I know that for myself as well, that self-medication with alcohol. If you're feeling socially anxious, that first sort of sip of alcohol at 13 was like, wow, this stuff really is interesting. It was, and now there's the bad side of that as well. But also trouble sleeping. I mean, anxiety, there's a lot of ruminating thoughts, and with those overactive brain at night, I'm sure a lot of people before a major event in your life have probably had a night of not so quality sleep. It's the most common type of mental health problem. Over 400,000 adults in BC are currently living with an anxiety disorder. Over 60,000 youth and young adults, children. 1 in 10 have at least one, and 1 in 4 will have one at some point in their life. I heard a report today that 1 in 6 people in Canada in 2012 sought some mental health services. Not to say that they all got them, but 1 in 6 sought mental health services. So the numbers are quite large. So the thing with anxiety is it falls under the radar a lot. It's often hidden, overlooked, or misdiagnosed. With the two sides of anxiety, the fight or flight or freeze, you can have a very quiet, shy student that sort of never says much of anything, is never a problem. They're looked at almost as a model student. Meanwhile, they're terrified all day. But on the other hand, you can have sort of sometimes irritability and outbursts because anxiety with the adrenaline response can also elicit some aggressiveness as well. And individuals and families may suffer alone and in silence. It's, if mental health concerns are not talked about, if we don't educate children and teachers and influencers in our lives, then they're not going to necessarily see how the behaviors play out. And anxiety doesn't usually travel alone. Just because a person gets a diagnosis of social anxiety, it's quite possible that they might also have generalized anxiety. Somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder may exhibit some other type of anxiety as well. With panic disorder, sometimes it starts with generalized anxiety or social anxiety and may develop into full-blown panic with or without agoraphobia. And as far as low mood or depressive symptoms, that's very common with somebody with anxiety. And it's also common for somebody with a mood disorder to also have some anxiety as a result of their mood disorder. So they say that it's sort of two sides of the same coin, because it's sort of understandable. If you start to isolate because of your anxiety, your mood is going to go down, and vice versa. And there is a greater risk of developing substance use problems. So the types of anxiety disorders in adults: the social anxiety disorder, and it could be general, it could be just about anything social. It could be making a phone call, could be approaching a stranger. It could be a variety of things, but as I said, it could also be specific. Specific phobias, well, that's everything from spiders, snakes, heights, public speaking, all of those things. Generalized anxiety disorder, excessive worry. When somebody's got clinical generalized anxiety disorder, it really plays into your life in a very negative way, because there's incessant worry about almost everything. And when that's going on with a person, it's very difficult to have moments of reprieve or relaxation or even peace of any kind. Post-traumatic stress disorder. We hear a lot about military people coming over from tours of duty and multiple tours of duty. It's a real problem, especially with multiple tours of duty. But it also happens to first responders, but it also happens to people witnessing a car accident. Sometimes I've even heard post-traumatic stress can happen to people that have heard about these things enough. If they've got a sensitivity to it, that there isn't a clear-cut sort of, this has to happen in order to have PTSD. But PTSD, there's a lot of disruption, night terrors, any of the triggers that happen, whether it was a smell at a certain place where this event happened, whether it was associated with an automobile accident, you may not be able to ride in a car or drive a car again. So there's a variety of triggers that attach themselves to that. And obsessive compulsive disorder, which can be complicated, because that also has a variety of ways that it presents. I've got the slide here, my anxiety is, but I had some social anxiety definitely as a young child, generalized anxiety, panic disorder with agoraphobia in my 20s. And that lasted for probably 20 years before getting some treatment and working on it with my tools. I'm going to get into that more in the second half about my story. So anxiety disorders have specific symptoms, but within disorders, individuals have different awareness of their symptoms. So everybody's sort of fingerprint, it's not a come one, come all. Everybody has different things that are triggers. Everybody has different things that get the anxiety roller coaster going. So it can be like when an anxious situation comes up, sort of the normal physiological responses are rapid heart rate, rapid breathing, tightness in the chest, definitely sweating, stomach upset, dizziness, and lightheadedness. And actually on the Anxiety BC website, if you go into sort of why do these things happen, there really is a survival aspect to all of those physiological symptoms, like I mentioned with the situation of the bear. Now, on the mind side of it, sort of the cognitive symptoms, There's a fear of negative events, something bad happening. Unwanted thoughts, lots of worry, or memories. And there again, it's got a unique flavor. Everybody has their own sort of things that can be trigger points as far as the cognitive side, the thoughts that feed into the anxiety. So what do people do as far as the behavior when they're anxious? The easiest thing for anybody to do that is experiencing anxiety or has an anxiety disorder is avoidance, because avoidance works instantly. But the problem with avoidance is it reinforces the fear. So every time you avoid, you are reinforcing the perceived fear or danger, and although it works instantly, it has a means of making the anxiety worse and worse. So just some situations: not going to work, school, or leaving the house. This was back to school. We got some calls at Anxiety BC. My child is got some school refusal. They don't want to go to school. They've got tantrums, all this sort of thing. So you start to see it. I mean, you even hear about parents getting really anxious right now with the scheduling changes and sometimes even the separation with their kids going to school. I heard just recently some parents were crying and unable to let go of their child's hand when they were going to school. So anxiety does affect all of us. Not talking to strangers. I mean, I guess in one way we sort of tell kids that, but there is sort of, with having conversation with people in the appropriate place is a good thing for us. Going to parties. Ooh, there's that public speaking again. Avoidance of enclosed or wide open spaces. That's the portion of panic disorder, the agoraphobia. Agoraphobia can be where somebody does not want to leave their home, but it's also described as fear of open places and sometimes places like shopping malls, bank lineups, things like that, where you feel that your ability to flee or escape a situation is compromised, and then the anxiety starts to elevate. Not using public washrooms. So, and there's some subtle avoidance, not stating opinions or being assertive. You can say no, it's okay. Purposefully not drawing attention to yourself in a group. Social anxiety, I know that very well. Nothing to stand out. You don't want to be, you don't want to have the teacher point you out and say, what's the answer to this? Because once the anxiety goes way up, your brain sort of shuts down and you can't think of the right thing to say at that time. So it's wearing dark clothes or inconspicuous styles. Everybody has their way of blending in. Procrastinating and taking longer to make decisions. Well, there again, that feeds into that same discussion around avoidance being the easiest thing. If I don't think about doing it, if I put it off, I know I want to do it, but if you think about it, by avoiding something you really need to do, what is that going to do at the end of the day? It's probably going to increase your anxiety because you're now worried about this thing that you're putting off, and it actually turns, the idea of a molehill into a mountain. So how I got help. I definitely researched on the computer a lot, lots of searches. What is this that's going on with me? But there again, I'm going to get into my personal story with it and be a little more specific about that, about my path, my story. There's a relief when you talk to somebody about any mental health condition. The minute you could actually get it off your chest and talk to a trusted friend, a family member, a significant other, or a mentor, that first sort of admission of, hey, I'm noticing something going on, it's sort of the first step to some relief for sure. And as I said, how common mental health conditions really are, and the fact that it's a portion of our overall health, it just really maddens me, the fact that people are still hiding, and we're not normalizing this, because I see road rage every day. I see sort of elements of not having good mental health constantly. Now, a lot of people see their GP first, but there's counselors, trained psychologists, psychiatrists. Cognitive behavioral therapy is an evidence-based treatment option, very effective for anxiety disorders. And even the things like mindfulness, and that is a good way of sort of ensuring sort of getting into good strategies for managing sort of the elevation of the stress. We saw the apathetic cycle and extreme anxiety. So the more you sort of use some of these tools, the more you recognize when you're starting to feel anxious. And when you notice you're starting to feel it, that's the best time to utilize these strategies to learn how to manage it. So here's an example. With cognitive behavioral therapy, part of it gets into the exposure side of things. So if a fear was interacting with others, and if making eye contact, smiling, and starting a conversation with a stranger on a hierarchy, if you said, what would be the thing that would be the biggest challenge for me, then when you do these hierarchies with an exposure therapy, or that part of the cognitive behavioral therapy treatment, you would rate things from a 1 out of 10 scale to a 10 out of 10 scale, and you would do each of those repeatedly enough times that you can have the anxiety actually come up and then stay in it, and then repeat it. And that will slowly diminish the feeling, the intensity, and if not the intensity right away, at least the duration on which you recover from that peak of your anxiety. So hierarchies are used for just about anybody when they're at that exposure level of their, if you're using cognitive behavioral therapy as a treatment option, then that would be how that part of the treatment works. There's always lifestyle and different things as well. I mean, there's a huge power in journaling, writing things down, especially with worriers. If you worry about anything, there is so much power in putting pen to paper and writing the stuff down, because then it's an active way of getting it out of your head onto something you can read, and you actually process it differently. And part of cognitive behavioral therapy is cognitive restructuring and realistic thinking. And if you actually put the fear, what is this thing that's going to happen? What's the chance of it happening? Has it ever happened before, this catastrophic thing that I keep thinking is going to happen if I talk to a stranger or do some of these other things, or drive over a bridge, or there's a whole variety of different issues and triggers that people can have. But the fact of applying realistic thinking to the thought. So if you have fears about anything, write them down, look at it, do some realistic thinking with it. Has this worst thing happened to me before? If my best friend said this to me, what would I tell them? How would I reassure them? What would I say that isn't just sort of fluff and saying, oh, you should feel better, that's not going to happen? You actually apply some realistic thinking and say that, chances are my car is not going to break down in the middle of the bridge. I'm not going to have my panic attack. It's going to put me over the edge. I'm going to end up in hospital. I'm going to have a heart attack, all of these things. When you write this down, you apply the realistic thinking to it. You keep a thought diary or a thought journal. It's a really effective tool. It's one of the most effective tools, I think. Obviously, the lifestyle, a little bit of exercise is great. I mean, it's and it doesn't, people to think that the gym relate the gym instantly to exercise. It doesn't have to be the gym. It could be a walk. It could be badminton. It could be taking, gardening, for goodness sake. You get a lot of great exercise doing stuff like wash the car, vacuum, and the house is clean afterward and you got some exercise. Relaxation, leisure, good things. Everybody needs to learn the things that they need to make them relax. People with chronic anxiety, for me, I had neck pain, back pain. I'd grind my teeth in my sleep, so then I would have all sorts of, my neck would be constantly tight. And as I sort of unraveled, if I just go and get massage for my neck, the truth is that wasn't the root cause. I can end up getting massages for my neck for the rest of my life, but if I don't need the massage for my neck, then I'm avoiding that. So I did different things as far as how I go to sleep. If I need to wear a mouth guard so I don't grind my teeth, then that helps with that as well. So there's strategies for a whole bunch of these things. But people with chronic anxiety really don't usually have an idea of what feeling relaxed is. And at first, it's almost threatening. When you first go through sort of a progressive muscle relaxation thing, the first time I did that, I almost freaked out because my body was feeling really relaxed. And it was such an unusual feeling for me that it was scary. And it has a note down there, controlling anxiety versus abolishing anxiety. When people call the office, they say, I want to cure my anxiety. And I tell them, well, you might actually want to keep some of it because it actually can be very helpful. And when you actually demystify and get rid of sort of the monster that anxiety can be, it's amazing. And so the whole idea is it's about learning how to manage it. And occasionally, for myself, yes, I will slip back sometimes. Sometimes I'll feel panicky in a bank lineup still. But I don't leave, and I'm able to stay there. And I give myself a pat on the back when I leave, and I go, yeah, that was nothing. What was that? That was sort of whatever. It doesn't have the same power it once had. Believe me, I'm standing here talking in front of you. I would have been rather dead first when I was a kid, for sure, than speak in public. So it's a lifelong journey. It sounds like work, all of this, but to be honest with you, it isn't. It's good to do some things to learn how to relax. It's a lot of the cognitive behavioral therapy techniques are actually life skills. These things are not just for people dealing with anxiety disorders. Learning how to manage anxiety is a life skill. Everybody should learn it. Kids should learn it. It should be reinforced in elementary school, in high school, on the job, everywhere else. It really is a life skill. So that's why that idea of, do I want to cure myself of it? Well, it's altered my path in so much of a better way than I ever would have imagined, that if I didn't have these anxiety disorders, I think my life would be a lot more boring than it's ended up being. And even if some of the excitement has just been in my head for a while there. So there are when they say relapse, but once you learn about what anxiety is, there's a lot of power in education. And so when you learn about it and you know what's happening to your mind, your body, everything else, once you know that, there is real power in that. You will never be back at the point you were when you had no idea what was going on with you, when there was no help around, when there wasn't a friend or a therapist or somebody to talk to or a group of people that you could get together with. So it's not so bad. You'll never be back to square one. And there again, I mean, isn't it a nice trigger if you notice your anxiety is going up again? Now your body's telling you what's going on. You reassess what you're doing in your life. Hey, I'm way too busy. I'm burning myself out. I've got to learn to say no to some of this stuff. So, better that than to have these health conditions creep up. Stress is on a continuum for everybody. So everybody's life, you will have times in your life where it's trucking along pretty good, not a lot of stress going on. Then all of a sudden, these unexpected things happen. Job loss, somebody dies, illness, stress goes up through the roof, you're working way too many hours, all of these kinds of things. For a lot of people, chronic stress will lead to all sorts of physiological problems, stomach problems, heart problems, sleep problems, relationship problems, a whole bunch of problems. If you learn, and for some people, when that stress is at a high level, then it triggers their anxiety disorder. It says there on one of the bullet points, a booster shot to help your skills and strategies in mind. And that's what I noticed at times too, is it's a good, it's a gauge. How am I doing in my life? And when I start noticing my anxiety starting to creep up again, then I do a quick check. Am I doing too much? What can I do to improve things? Should I exercise a little more have I fallen off that? How am I eating? All of these things. Things with some pretty good quick results as well. Setting goals, that's a good thing. Goals to face fears. Because it's one thing to get past a fear, but once you get past that fear, then you start to actually reach out to do things that you've sort of been dreaming of, because there is this effect of feeling better about everything once you start overcoming some of this anxiety, and you will actually start probably setting some goals that you never thought you were going to be doing before that. This slide just has some of the resources. Family physicians, CBT self-help materials. Anxiety BC has, it's all CBT-based self-help materials on the website. There's new sections for youth and young adult, which is interactive. There's a brand new section for new mums and expectant mums. And we even have an app. And it's called MindShift. And it was designed for youth and young adults, but I use it because I like it. It's got some visualization, audio things on it. It's got a bunch of situational things, like real life situations, and what your plan can look like for managing it. And having a mobile tool, a coach that you can take with you anywhere, because it's one thing learning about these in the comfort of your home, your office, your laptop, in the library, or wherever. But what we're happy about with the app is we're saying, get out into the world, get out into the real world, and get yourself exposed to some of these things, and this should be a help. So it's called MindShift. It's free. So whether it's Apple or an Android device, the MindShift app is free. And like I said, it was designed for youth and young adult, but there's no reason why everybody can't have a look at it and give it a try. I'm going to read the story of my anxiety that I put into the Visions Workplaces issue, and this was in 2009. So I'm going to read the story to you, and then I will add a little bit to it, and then after that I'll take some questions. So it says, keeping a lid on panic. My first panic attack happened when I was 24, at work. My youth had been a mix of laughter, play, and curiosity, and excessive worry, anxiety, and stomach aches. But this was something new. I was the shop foreman at an ultralight aircraft manufacturing facility. We'd been under the gun for 6 months, working excessive amounts of overtime to fill the orders. If these orders weren't completed and shipped on time, the contracts would become void. The overtime resulted in more things going wrong, and I had a boss with a temper. Out of the blue one day, my heart started pounding and I was sweating profusely. I thought I was either going crazy or having a heart attack, and then I lost consciousness. A few minutes later, I felt a bit better, but my boss insisted on taking me to the hospital emergency, where after blood work and checking out my heart, they didn't find anything wrong with me. But the following next few weeks at work were absolutely terrible. I started having these attacks several times a day and not knowing what was happening to me. I remember having anywhere from 6 to 10 panic attacks in a day. And because the emergency visit didn't find anything wrong, and because all it took to trigger an attack was thinking about it happening again. And I did my best to hide what was going on. So I finally went to my doctor. He gave me some pills. I don't remember what they were. I started taking them to calm me down. But I left the doctor's office without any sort of diagnosis as to what was really happening. It was the 80s, and there was very little awareness about anxiety disorders. I only used the pills occasionally when I had a really bad day, and I found that increasing my exercise, I just sort of did that intuitively just to escape what was going on in my head, that it seemed to help somewhat as well. But even as things were getting better on one level, I was always aware that the wrong feeling or the wrong circumstance could once again trigger an attack. So I decided to leave that job. Now I'm going to fast forward on the story 20 years. So fast forwarding 20 years, over that time I experienced varying degrees of panic along the way. I tried different medications, made trips to a psychiatrist. I did lots of research on the web, and I also experienced a lot of different work situations. Occasionally I'd leave a job because of stress, sometimes because of my personal desire to learn and grow and do something else. And sometimes there was actually, company was folding and things along those lines. In 2004, I was a self-employed contractor testing and inspecting hydrogen fuel cell buses. I began having multiple panic attacks a day again. My attacks happened mostly at work, even though the pressure I was feeling had probably more to do with my worry about financial uncertainty, because I'd purchased a condo the previous year, and the 3-year work contract was ending in September. I felt like I was between a rock and a hard place. Being self-employed, I wasn't covered by extended health plan. I had no paid sick time, so I just had to grin and bear my situation as best I could. I think the attacks happened more at work because of the greater interaction there and the fear dynamic. Even though it wasn't visibly obvious that I was having an attack, the way a seizure or something like that would be, my fear of being witnessed really fed the panic. And my way of coping with these attacks at work was to use avoidance strategies. Because of the stigma, I wasn't ready to admit a problem to others or myself. And when the attacks started, I'd quietly remove myself from the situation, and the panic would slowly subside. Once I was off work, I found leaving the house became harder each day. Panic disorder has an unsympathetic way of constantly attaching the triggers that provoke anxiety to more and more areas of one's life. I was afraid to be in public places in case I had a panic attack. A simple trip to the grocery store or the bank made me feel like a soldier walking through hostile territory with sniper rifles aimed at me the entire time. But by not leaving the house, however, I was reinforcing the belief that I'd never be okay, and my life was about to implode. I was drowning in future negative thinking and had visions of losing everything I'd worked for. So in my isolation, I was searching the internet, trying to find out what I could do. I found out about the Anxiety Disorders Clinic at the University of British Columbia, and I went to a doctor at a walk-in clinic and wanted a referral. Now, all I had to do was wait 6 months. When I finally received the call in March 2005, it was a day before I was going to start a new job. And man, was I anxious starting that new job and going through the recruitment process and everything, but I just barely held it together. I was back in the aviation industry as a full-time employee with benefits. And all I could do is think about how bad the timing was, because I'd just been home for 6 months, ready and willing to get help, but now that it had come through, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to make it to the appointments from Delta to UBC once a week. I was going to ask for time off, but when you're just starting a new job, there's no way that would be something I would have even considered. Now, I was able to get the therapy times so that I was able to get out of work and get there and be the last one at UBC for an appointment. And it's amazing how motivation to get better can force a person to do things you wouldn't otherwise think possible. I developed a fear of driving over bridges, but I did white-knuckle it over bridges and made it to all 8 one-on-one therapy sessions. The therapy I received at UBC is called cognitive behavioral therapy. It isn't easy. A big part of it deals with facing your fears. But because of how much I'd already suffered with anxiety, I was motivated to do whatever it took. Over the 8 sessions, I built my own customized toolkit. The toolkit contained relaxation techniques. It contained work through scenarios in which I had challenged my negative thoughts and developed much more realistic thinking. I practiced on the uncomfortable body sensations, like the dizziness, being out of breath, and feeling out of body. There was ways of spinning in a chair, running on the spot, doing all of these things and becoming desensitized and comfortable with the sensations that follow those feelings. And I would allow them to dissipate naturally without becoming fearful. Then I wrote out my list of most fearful to least fearful activities, and that was the hierarchy I was describing. Starting at the bottom of the list with the least fearful activity, I'd repeat the activity until the anxiety level was reduced by at least half, and this built confidence on approaching the next activity. Once you have CBT tools to help maintain your anxiety, they're with you for a lifetime. Even if there is a relapse of some panic, it'll never be the same as it once was. The therapy builds one small victory at a time and will actually become hardwired over time. With the help of the CBT sessions, I was doing quite well overall, getting through my days without having or worrying about having a panic attack. In fact, the CBT techniques helped me challenge myself in areas I wouldn't have otherwise, like public speaking. However, we don't always know what life is about to deliver. I'd been building my confidence for some time, so in September 2005, I applied for a manager's job at the workplace, knowing full well that the work stress would increase. The challenge was too tempting, and I was feeling better than I had in years, and I was the successful candidate. Within 1 month of becoming a manager, however, life delivered some heart-wrenching news. My father was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and it took 2 months of quick deterioration until he died. I made time to be there every day and was with him during his final moments, but my father's illness opened up a new world of things to cope with. At work, I could feel the stress building daily. I was expected to work 10 to 12 hours a day, to hire and fire employees, to attend 12 scheduled meetings a week, as well as manage the daily production schedules and large crews of hourly paid employees. I had constant stiffness in my shoulders, back, and neck. I woke up every morning tied up in knots with a sore jaw from grinding my teeth at night. After 2 years of this, I started getting the panic attacks at work again, especially during meetings. My survival instincts of fleeing the situation would kick in. I'd go to the washroom, rinse my face with cold water, and try to pull it together. But I knew my avoidance strategy would not be helpful in the long run. This spike in anxiety had as much to do with the fact that I hadn't been practicing the skills that I'd learned, keeping my anxiety under control, at least not practicing enough. I tried to practice on walks at lunchtime, but on the job there was no opportunity. And by the time I got home, I was absolutely exhausted from work anyway. I felt burnt out and decided to pay my doctor a visit. He recommended that I take 6 weeks stress leave from work and visit him every couple of weeks to update. The Human Resources Department at my workplace contacted me to find out what was happening and when I could be expected back to work. I explained my situation, but realized after the conversation that they had no real understanding as to why my doctor had recommended I take time off. I felt pressured to return to work, ready or not, so I decided to better reassess my future with the company. I took a hard look at my life, my values, and my needs, and decided that I should look for something more suitable. Now, I was out of work for a while. I built a shed, did a lot of walks, and then I found an opening at Anxiety BC, whom I'd been doing some volunteer work already by then, so I had known several of the people. And at Anxiety BC, having a mental health condition or an anxiety disorder is actually an asset. So ultimately, I continue to learn that there's no health without mental health. And so the story I just read in a matter of minutes covered about 40 years of my life. And I touched on some significant moments and sort of, major portions of it. But the fact is, when you deal with anxiety for that many years, it's with you every day. It's with you every day, sometimes every hour, and sometimes every minute. So there is a whole bunch of stories in between those. I think back about my parents, and I remember my mom when I was a kid. She was a real worrier, and there is the nature versus nurture. Yes, there's a little bit of environment that can cause it. And yes, little kids are sponges, and they sort of see how their parents react to things and do follow. So sometimes it does run in the family, but it doesn't necessarily do so. But my mom was a real worrier. She was afraid of a lot of things, terrified of mice. I remember a couple incidents as a kid. My goodness, there was a mouse in the house, and I was watching her, and she jumped up on the sink, and she was running around. My father had undiagnosed PTSD. He was a logger in BC. He was a construction worker. At that time in the Queen Charlottes in the 50s and 60s, it was tough work. It was one of those jobs that had the highest casualty and death rate of anything in the province and probably the country. He witnessed a lot of horrific accidents at work, and he had a few near-death experiences himself. And as a result, when he was married to my mom at 30 years old, they had to get separate beds because at night he would have night terrors, and he was worried that he would accidentally hit her. He ground his teeth down to nothing, so he had to get crowns. And all through my life, I wondered why he was a bit irritable, and some of these other things were going on. And it wasn't until I realized what was going on with me, and the more I learned about anxiety, that he had been dealing his whole life, or his whole adult life, with most of it from 30 years old with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a shame, and nobody should have to go through their life with that. I have had generalized anxiety disorder, which I call the mothership of anxiety disorders, because all of them are welcome once you have that. GAD welcomes all. I think of like the Star Trek Enterprise or something, and everyone's welcome. You hear about OCD, and then you start, not stepping on cracks and everything. The panic attack kicked in, the social was there, everyone was welcome. But it didn't mean that even if a person displays some tendencies with an anxiety disorder, the cutoff line is sort of how much is it affecting your life, how much is it causing a real disturbance or otherwise. So just because you may display some anxiety doesn't mean it's a disorder. And you know yourself whether you're avoiding things that you would like to do because of it. So, that's just something to consider as well. The anxious mind, it took me 45 years to realize that the difference between a bad day and a good day was more about my interpretation of it than the actual circumstances of the day. That was a wake-up call to realize that how I thought about things and situations and recognizing when my mind was starting to fear something, whether it was just something coming up or how I'm reacting to something. Your mind is a tool. It's not who you are. If you're thinking certain patterns, become aware of how you're thinking, because the soundtrack in a person's head is quite often very negative. And there comes a time to stand up against it and say, I'm not going to believe that anymore. You wouldn't want that with your worst enemy. Be aware of your thoughts. It's really important, because that's sort of that first step to going, I don't have to believe that. I've been listening to that for way too long. It's not who I am. So, as I was saying, be aware of cognitive behavioral therapy. The idea is become your own therapist. You know how things are going. You know how you relate. You know what things you're avoiding, what makes you anxious. Become aware of your own triggers. And I like to think that, even for myself, just managing my anxiety is fine. It's a good place to be, whatever. But there's a point where that's not good enough anymore. It's about reaching beyond and sort of approaching your wishes and your dreams in life and saying, if I could overcome that, and that, and to somebody else, it really is like from going from fearing public speaking and rather being dead to public speaking really is like somebody climbing Mount Everest. It is monumental. It takes some work, but when you're there, it opens up your life to so many new and exciting things. This last December, I decided that I wanted to improve on my public speaking because everybody here has a story to tell. All of you do. You have a unique story to tell, and if you don't, people learn by sharing stories. So it's important to be able to share your story. So maybe some of you will be writers or whatever, but share your story. So in December, I thought I need to make public speaking a better goal. I need to work on it. So I went to a Toastmasters club in my community. I signed up. I almost quit. I was there and I was like, this is not what I want to do. I almost bolted twice, but I hung in there. And just a couple weeks ago, actually, it was sort of an unexpected thing. And I wasn't going to bring this out, but I looked at it and I thought, I need to end this talk with sort of some getting you fired up, not just finding out how anxious you might be, but to see the other side of it. So I got the Rookie of the Year at my Toastmasters club this summer. And all of you can do that, whether it's Toastmasters or anything else. You got something that you need to do, get the plan in place to do it. So at this point, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take a few questions. Well, as I say, I'm not a psychologist myself, and usually the quickest signs are a change in behavior, not necessarily just behavior, because what you just described was sort of a lifestyle that you also had, so maybe that's partly genetic. And, young kids at that age really need a lot of sleep. They're growing, their bodies are changing, they need a ton of sleep. Have really good communication. If you open up about your own sort of, if you crack that surface and mention that sometimes I'm afraid of something, and if you open up the dialogue and say, is there anything in your life that's going on? But usually, I think with the psychologists, it's usually seeing a real change. That things that they would have been doing that are sort of the normal paths that they're doing. because kids have different interests and they need some downtime too. Kids are really, really highly scheduled these days. They're like busy from morning till night, so it's sort of refreshing to hear that he's able to lay down and listen to music. Well, yes, and the fact is there again, by having my first panic attack in my early 20s, and for anybody in their early 20s, the number one health concern for a young person is a mental health problem rising up at that point in their life. Their hearts are usually still good, all the rest of it, they're not diabetic yet, all these sorts of things. So a mental health concern is sort of what can happen. And the fact that I didn't get the help I needed for so long, that these sort of responses to the triggers were hardwired for a long time. And the earlier somebody learns about what you can do in applying the techniques to change the reaction, because the body just would trigger. And it was severe, because as I mentioned in the one part, I was agoraphobic for a while and really having a hard time leaving my place. And bridges were a huge trigger. And when I was leading panic disorder groups with the LEAF program through Anxiety BC, it was amazing how many stories were almost identical. Maybe not as severe, but as far as the triggers, it was almost like textbook. Well, there was a few years ago, what happened was the Anxiety Disorders Clinic, which also did a lot of research there as well, new protocol, new techniques, some of those things. They shut that down at UBC. The health regions themselves now, though, like if somebody calls the office, Royal Columbian, like Fraser Health has group therapy for group CBT. Vancouver Coastal has CBT. So the health region have been embracing it and sort of taking that on. But also, the UBC School of Psychology actually does take referrals now as well. So there are different ways.
Is that for one-to-one though? Is what I'm hearing?
UBC, the school might be one-to-one, but generally, there are some, we've got links from the website. I mean, the private option is always a assured way of getting one-to-one, but obviously not everyone can afford a private option. Some people have extended health benefits if they're at work and this is happening, and the workplace really is happy to see that, wow, if this person can return within sort of 2 months with this, that's, it's sort of a money saving for them as well. Well, but there again, and what's interesting is, like was mentioned, is sort of that personal fingerprint of everybody and recognizing what your triggers are. So if for most people it would be strangers, but for you it's people that you're familiar with, then that would be where you would be setting, doing some goal setting and some hierarchy, is actually working on it with the people that you can work on reducing your anxiety through exposure. So recognizing it is good. It's just the everyone's triggers, can be very, slightly different and unique to your situation. Well, every few years somebody else does a new report, but even, as far as a global report, the WHO, World Health Organization, just this last year published 25% will have a mental health.
I read it. It's by 2020.
Yes.
Mental illness is the number 2 killer, next to cancer. That's from WHO.
Okay. Yeah, but as you know, sort of major studies like that are cost prohibitive, and for people to do that process, to spend the money, they need to have a reason why they're doing it, and so But in all honesty, it seems like, if anything, the numbers are growing somewhat, but they don't seem to be reducing, but the ratios seem to be pretty much fairly consistent even over the last 10 years. Well, lots of people can have a panic attack in any given year in their life. Some people recognize, but it's what you attach to it. Some people will be overworked. They've just drank a bunch of coffee. They're on a crowded bus. It's hot. They're sweating. They have a panic attack. One person may go, wow, that was unpleasant, and then just sort of carry on, where somebody else would go through that situation. And if that started to trigger more panic attacks, and then, see, the difference between the anxiety disorders themselves is the core fear. And so panic disorder, as opposed to just a panic attack, is the fear of another panic attack. Well, yeah, absolutely. You've probably heard that saying, when the teacher is ready, the student will appear. Or is it the other way around? Either way, it's something like that. Casual at first, get the conversation going. Ask her to look at our website materials just on her own. Don't hover over her when she does it. There's video clips. If she connects with some of the people on it, the website, the youth and young adult section of the website makes sense to her. The Kelty Mental Health Center has what's called a youth in residence, somebody that's actually dealt with a mental health condition that she can actually talk to. You can call them first. So with young people, a lot of times what I've found, the McCreary Foundation, they've got great reports. They're from Vancouver. You can just look it up, McCreary Foundation. They said young people go to other young people first. So if she's got some good information, like the website and then talking to somebody there. So just plant the seed. Ask her to have a look at the website. Don't tell her when and where. And then after a week or so, just say, did you have a chance? What do you think? So yeah, it's just sort of allow her to want it. Not a particular one. Now, I mean, with the whole idea between sort of nutrition, maybe supplements, things like that. I mean, there's a lot of different things going on, and sort of healthy eating anyway is a good thing. In some cases, talking to a pharmacist or something, there might be some certain suggestions as far as things that generally cause a person a little more anxiety, but as far as just looking to one thing as a cure-all, I would say be careful of that, like do some of the other work as well. But I mean, but I don't know of any particular, like, sort of the anxiety diet or something labeled as that. Absolutely, great question. One of the first things you learn after you go through the educational part about what anxiety is and how it affects you, then you start getting into strategies. And there was a doctor way back in the 50s or something, I think his name was Herbert Benson, and it was called the relaxation response. And what he found, that through diaphragmatic breathing exercise, that would elicit the relaxation response. So for anybody, I mean, one of the first plans you learn when you're doing your anxiety strategy is, what are some of the things I can do? Diaphragmatic breathing, starting to do it daily, is a fantastic tool to reducing anxiety. There's all sorts of apps that have it. We have visualization things on our app. There are diaphragmatic breathing exercises on the website, on the app. Everybody, if somebody's doing, some people meditate and deep breathe, some people do Tai Chi and deep breathe, some people do other things or just deep breathe. Diaphragmatic breathing is fantastic. It's just to get your baseline down. And when you do things like that enough and you start diaphragmatic breathing, then it also reduces sort of that negative thought pattern that happens as well. So it's a great tool. As well as progressive muscle relaxation and things like that. Obviously with the whole health regimen, some people like yoga, some people like to garden, some people like to walk. Those are sort of active, if you've got your headphones on listening to Black Sabbath when you're walking, it's probably not mindful walking. But if you're walking without any interruption and just breathing while you're walking and just being present, it's great. Wonderful thing to do. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.